Hi, everyone. Welcome to the seminar. We're really excited today to continue with our first guest seminar for the quarter. So the topic is on the topic for the seminar overall is on food rescue innovation. And we've got Brian Lipinski here from the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., who's really going to be setting the scene. So in our first session, we talked about the seminar overall, and I provided some very kind of succinct framings. And Brian, with his expertise at WRI and the over decade long career he's had working on food loss and food waste, is going to present us with a global perspective on reducing food loss and food waste and what a global agenda might look like. And we've shared some resources with you all via Canvas so that you can do some background reading on that if you haven't already. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you all for being here. It's amazing seeing almost 200 people here. So that's awesome. Yes, my name is Brian Lipinski. I'm with the World Resources Institute, which I'll explain who we are in just a moment. And yeah, I'm going to be just sort of setting the stage about the global picture of what food loss and waste looks like. And so you'll hear me say food loss and waste a lot. I might just say food waste sometimes. These terms have some nuances that I don't think we really need to get too much into, but basically it's any food that was intended for human consumption that doesn't actually get eaten. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But just to put that up front about the terms and terminology. So just a little bit about WRI and why I'm someone who is worth listening to about this and my own career. So WRI, the World Resources Institute, we're a global research nonprofit where we aim to really, the term used to be think tank, but we really aim to make our research actionable and practicable in the real world and try to address some of the major concerns that are taking place at the sort of intersection of environment and human well-being. And so I'm based in Washington, D.C., but on this map, you can see all of our various offices around the world. We really are a global organization. I started at WRI in 2009 after finishing my grad school at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. And I've been working on food waste since about 2011. So something that it's not actually a topic I initially thought I would start working on. It's something I sort of fell into as part of my progression at the organization. And now I'm feel so lucky that it's something I've been able to devote my career to because it really is just an endlessly interesting topic. Some of the things we've done, we're the secretariat for something called the Food Loss and Waste Protocol, which is definitely on the wonkier side, so I won't be getting into that too much. But it's a global standard that essentially helps everyone to speak in the same terms and language about food loss and waste, and I'll explain why that matters in a moment. We're the Secretariat for Champions 12.3, which is a group of government ministers, CEOs, heads of nonprofits who are all committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3, which I'll show you a little bit later, but basically it's a global goal to cut food loss and waste in half by the end of this decade. And we've also just put out a number of major reports on food loss and waste, which I'll be going into one of them a bit more specifically today, which is the Setting a Global Action Agenda. At the end, we'll have some chances for Q&A, some time. So I'm not sure if normally people ask those questions out loud or drop them in the chat, but if you have questions along the way that you just want to get out while we're on a slide, go for it, drop it in the chat, and I'll address it. And then if you want to ask a question during that Q&A portion out loud, we can do it at that time as well. So I think we all have a sort of intuitive understanding of what food waste is, but I think we all tend to think of it maybe as, moldy bread sitting in a trash can or a dumpster full of full of food behind a grocery store, and you hear about dumpster divers and things like that. So that's definitely part of it. But here's a little diagram about what food loss and waste can be at its most expansive definition. So you start off at the top with all of the food, pretty much everything that's intended for human consumption as food. Then you get into a breakdown of between food, the parts that you actually eat, and inedible parts. So things like bones, rinds, pits, all that. That's still a component of food and it has to go somewhere. So then the box that just came up is what we call the destinations. And that's where food goes when it leaves the human food supply chain. So these are pretty much everywhere that it could go. So landfill is probably the one we're most familiar with and what we tend to have that sort of immediate sense of what food waste feels like and what we think of. But sending it to the sewer, sending it to animal feed, sending it to an anaerobic digester, these are all different possible destinations that some people would interpret as food waste and some would not. So this is already where this gets to be a little bit more complex of an issue than you would even think, because certainly when I started working on this, the idea that food gets wasted and there's so much of it, it was like, well, why on earth are we doing that? That seems like such a no-brainer to not waste food. And this is just sort of setting the stage of, well, it's unfortunately a bit more complex than we would like. So, oops, we're going backwards. Oh. So, having said that of what the sort of components of food loss and waste are, here's why this is so important. About a third of all the food we produce every year is lost or wasted. And actually, more recent estimates have taken that up to maybe even 40%. So that's huge. And that's about $940 billion cost to the global economy each year, probably even higher now with the more recent estimates. And 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to food loss and waste. Just to put that in context, if food loss and waste were its own country, if you had, food loss and waste nation, it would be the world's third largest greenhouse gas emitter after China and the US. So it's not insignificant by any stretch. And of course, there's the human component of all of this, the sort of social and moral component that we're throwing out all this food while there's still a global hunger problem and malnourishment problem. So there's the human angle, there's the environmental angle, and then there's the economic angle. Really one of these issues where no matter what angle you come at it from, there's a reason to care and a reason to want to take action on this. Of course, with COVID-19 and the way it's disrupted supply chains, we've heard about this happen, like even more food waste occurring because it couldn't get to restaurants or it couldn't get through the supply chain. And even just the other day, there was a huge recall on lettuce, and that's not necessarily COVID-19 linked, but it is food waste, which is another one of these hidden sorts of avenues where, of course, we shouldn't be eating food that gets recalled, but the fact that it needs to be recalled means that that food is, in fact, being wasted. Now, just to give you an explanation of what's happening in this chart, this is looking at different regions throughout the world and where the food waste tends to happen in the supply chain. So going from the green, where that's the production level, so things happening in the field or at the farm, you move through to handling and storage. So yeah, storage is pretty self-explanatory. Then to processing, what happens in a factory while it's being processed. Distribution and market, that's, for us, it would be like at the grocery store and other parts of the world, it would be more informal markets or distribution centers. And then consumption level is what happens once it's actually on your plate. And so what you can really see from this chart is that the end of the supply chain, the consumption side, is much more, the food waste is much more rampant in areas like North America, Europe, industrialized Asia. Whereas if you're looking at areas like sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia, the interventions really should be targeting the early stages of the supply chain, things happening more at the farm level and the storage level. So this is another one of those wrinkles of why this is such a difficult issue to tackle, because you're going to have very different interventions and very different approaches depending on what's most prevalent in your region of the world, or even in your country, or the sectors that are most important to a country. So then looking at, by weight, what gets lost and wasted in terms of types of foods, it does tend to be fruits and vegetables with the highest amount of weight. Part of that is because of the large amount of water that goes into the production of fruits and vegetables, and just the water weight of a fruit or vegetable itself. You can cut this a number of different ways. If I were to show you this chart saying loss and waste by calories, then you would actually see cereals become a much higher percentage of that because of their calorically dense nature. If I were to do it by protein, you would suddenly see, even though meat and fish and seafood tend to be kind of small from this perspective, by protein or by greenhouse gas emissions, suddenly those would become a much larger share of the pie. So again, it's depending on what your focus area is, you might end up targeting a different type of product. So it's probably a little bit self-explanatory at this point to say why should we try to reduce that food loss and waste, but just to give a little more detail on that. This is what I referenced, that sustainable development goal. So the sustainable development goals were a set of goals set by the United Nations to address sustainability across a very wide range of areas. So not just food, but pretty much every aspect of our lives, social, environmental, etc. This specific target, target 12.3, aims to halve per capita global food waste. And there's some nuances to that, but that's the essence of it, is that it is trying to cut food loss and waste in half. And so the benefits of this, from a social perspective, you improve food security and you feed hungry people now. It's not a magic sort of, let me see, the best way to say this. It's not that if we cut food waste that it's magically going to reach the people it needs. So that's something to keep in mind, that it's not just that quite that simple as reduce food waste, end hunger. But still, it's there is that connection of, we have the hungry people, why are we wasting food? From the environmental aspect, you can conserve all the natural resources that go into the production of food, because when you waste a piece of food, you're not just wasting that food itself, but you're wasting all of the water, the land, the fertilizer, the greenhouse gas emissions embedded in its production. So it's everything that's gotten it to that point. And then the economic argument is that food waste is essentially very inefficient. It's a waste of money, it's a waste of resources, and in many cases, businesses can actually generate new income and new products by getting a little bit creative about how they tackle food waste. And along those lines, in 2017, we did a study of more than 700 companies across 17 countries, and we found that for every $1 they invested in reducing food loss and waste in their businesses, it yielded a $14 return. That was the median return. And in many cases, these weren't huge changes. It's things like measurement, it's things like training your staff, improving inventory management, changing your packaging, selling imperfect produce. I think Imperfect Foods is your next guest speaker, creating new products, etc. So it's not about, investing in new expensive technologies necessarily, or some huge revamp, but it is about changing the way that you do things in sort of business as usual. And so this is a powerful one, depending on the audience, where, everyone wants to address food waste and no one thinks food waste is a good thing, but many businesses have to be sort of convinced that it makes sense for their bottom line. And so this is a useful figure in those cases. So seems like maybe it seems like a no-brainer. Why is this still a problem given that, the social angle is there, the environmental angle that is there, the economic angle is there? Why are we still having trouble with this if it seems so obvious that we shouldn't be wasting food? And there are a number of reasons for that. First, which I've sort of already alluded to, is that there's no silver bullet. So there's no one intervention that we could do today and suddenly we'd slash food waste in half. Unfortunately, because of the dispersed nature of the issue and, excuse me, because of the dispersed nature of the issue and the huge amount of actors in the food system, there are lots of small actions that need to be taken in every stage of the food supply chain that then add up to a bigger whole. So that's one of the really difficult things, is that it's not instituting one or two policies and celebrating a victory. It's really that you need hundreds of smaller changes to take place. And there tends to be a lack of coordinated action. So again, businesses might do something on their own, but like the entire grocery sector might not be doing something in a unified way that would make a difference. And you can give examples of that up the supply chain as well. So again, because of the very dispersed nature, it's difficult to get some of these interventions in place in a way that really becomes meaningful. Overcoming inertia is an issue where with businesses, they tend to have a perspective of, we've always done things this one certain way, it works, we're not going to change that. And so it becomes difficult to give that push to try something new, because many food companies are operating on very small margins. And so if some sort of change doesn't work out, it actually can be quite detrimental. At the sort of personal level, food in general is very personal. It's something that is wrapped up in every part of our day and our culture and our lives. And it can be difficult for people to make significant changes without feeling like they're being sort of, I don't know, intruded on in something very personal. And so we don't see that attitude quite so much with food waste as we do with something like, say, trying to get people to eat less beef or trying to shift to lower carbon diets, where you'll get a lot of resistance to that. But still, food is just so personal. It's something that people don't like to think about it having detrimental consequences necessarily, the way that they interact with food, the way they treat food. There's also a lack of data where, I showed you that those charts earlier, those numbers are actually from 2012, which was the last time that there was a big global effort to measure food loss and waste throughout the entire supply chain in all countries. A lot of countries aren't actually collecting good data about this. A lot of companies aren't collecting good data about this. So it's sort of the inverse. There's an old saying of what gets measured gets managed. So once you know what's happening in terms of measurements and data and what the hotspots are, you can then take action to focus in on it and address those issues. But if you don't know specifically what's happening with food waste in your own boundaries, in your own four walls, you're just kind of taking stabs in the dark to address it. And then finally, there's also a tendency to think of food loss and waste as someone else's problem. So this again is maybe more on the consumer level, but some surveys have shown that when people were asked how much food they waste, about 45% of people will say none, which is not true. Everyone wastes food. We all do it. I do it. I've been working on this for a decade. I still do it. So it's something that humans have a great capacity for rationalizing away the way that they handle something. So you might think that the food you waste is not food waste, or you might reframe it in a way of, oh, well, the bread was moldy, so it wasn't food anymore. It's like, yeah, but you didn't eat it when it was still edible. So that's that's food waste, whether you like it or not. So it does tend to be something that we are convinced that our neighbors are the ones who are throwing away all the food. And it's actually something each of us is doing, and also that companies are doing, and that governments need to be doing more to address. So it's everybody has their component, their part to play in this. So what needs to be done? Plenty. But what I've got here is our set of 10 recommendations, what we call the Global Action Agenda at WRI. These are very high level. I sort of deliberately kept it high level, knowing the course that you're going to be taking, the progression you're going to be taking with your speakers, where I know you're going to be getting a lot more into more detailed looks at certain stages of this, but also happy to take any questions about something more specific on any of these. So the first thing that we say needs to be done is that there need to be national strategies for reducing food loss and waste. Governments need to be tackling this issue in a coordinated way. And so I mentioned that Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, every UN member adopted that goal. However, the number of countries that have actually instituted a target within their own planning is not great. So here we've got in the green is the countries that have a national target aligned with that goal to cut food loss and waste in half. The yellow is countries that have only instituted that on the loss side of things, meaning closer to the farm level. And so that's just target setting. That's not even taking action. And then in terms of measurement, these are the countries that are actually measuring food loss and waste within their borders. So again, we're missing out on some really huge parts of the world. Some of the most populous countries in the world, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, aren't measuring and therefore aren't really taking action in the way that we need. Which I'm not saying that US and Europe are doing an amazing job on that either, but at least there's some national effort to measure. So develop the national strategies, helps to coordinate action, helps to set a national goal together. Next, create national public-private partnerships. And this is a little bit buzzwordy, but what it means is essentially taking those strategies and then partnering with the private sector to implement them. Since, the private sector is going to have to play a big role in any effort to address food loss and waste, given, they're our food system. They're the ones that get the food to us. So these national public-private partnerships, what they aim to do is to bring together entire sectors to work in a sort of pre-competitive way. So trying to make it the idea that instead of everyone working against each other and trying to have, the greater profit margin, it's let's see what we can do as the entire dairy sector. Let's see what we can do as the entire grocery sector and move that forward. This has been the UK has the best example of one of these. There are also some examples in the US, and Mexico are where I would say if you're interested in this, that's where it's taken the most shape. We've also suggested something what we call a 10 by 20 by 30 supply chain initiative. And I've got a slide here that explains that a little more. And there's a lot of text here, and I'm not going to read it all, but it's, I think you already have the slides or you'll be getting the slides. So, but what this is actually most of my day-to-day work right now is what we've done is we've worked with at least 10 of the world's largest food retailers. You'll see there are actually 12 of them on the side there. And what they do is they then bring in 20 of their suppliers. So people like Unilever, Pepsi, Kellogg's, names like that, to commit to reducing food loss and waste in their operations, but cutting it in half by 2030. And so what we do on our end is that we train your companies, we get them to measure, we support them in their journey along the way, we link them up with other companies to do the same thing. And so this is something that we started in 2020 and just finished the first year of this where about 150 companies for the first time were publicly reporting on their food loss and waste and now set baselines to work against. So the idea here was basically that, I'm Brian Lipinski from the World Resources Institute. If I go to Kellogg's and say, hello, would you like to cut your food waste in half? They'll probably say, who are you? We're busy. But if Walmart or Kroger comes to them and asks them to do that, then they're listening. So the idea is that it becomes sort of a snowball effect. Now looking at maybe things that are a little bit more targeted in terms of the interventions in the supply chain. There's invigorate efforts to strengthen value chains and reduce smallholder losses. And what this means is that essentially we need to support those smallholders, many of them in poorer countries who are maybe don't have the capital to make changes that would reduce food loss and waste. They don't know about storage solutions. They don't know about technologies. They don't have access to it, or even some very basic infrastructure things like they don't have a road that goes to the nearest market. And so in many cases, this isn't something you need to be doing just for food loss and waste. It's just good development in general to improve infrastructure, improve access to electricity, these sorts of things. So that's what we're looking at in this bullet. Another, we say launch a decade of storage solutions. Essentially, this means that there's a lot of storage technology out there that people just don't have access to and would make a big difference in terms of improving smallholder incomes, where they would be able to get more product to a market. They would be able to preserve it for longer. They would be able to sell it during an off season. So if they have a bumper crop, sometimes that's a cause of food waste where it just gets plowed back into the fields because there's nowhere to sell it. So storage and processing helps to prolong the life of the food, improve incomes, improve food access. Shift consumer social norms. And this is a little bit what I was talking about of how we don't think that we're wasting food, and we tend to not address that area within our own lives necessarily. And there are a couple of ways you can go about this. So here are a couple of examples. On the top, you'll see a webpage called savethefood.com. This was a national campaign that the Ad Council put together with the Natural Resources Defense Council, another nonprofit. And this was a very, I know here in DC, I saw it on bus stops, ads and things where they would just have little things about, oh, look how much food there's being wasted, and here are some things you can do to address it. So in some ways, that's great, because if there's someone who's maybe wasn't aware of the issue, but would be motivated to make a change based on seeing that sort of intervention, they have access to that information. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily useful for someone who doesn't care in the first place, or, in many cases, it's just a very busy person and doesn't have the mental energy to devote, or the, not necessarily mental energy, but just time in their day. But that's very much on the sort of give people information, let them do what they want with it sort of side of things. The other side, last summer, China adopted a law against food waste where you get fined for eating too much or having too many leftovers at a dinner or a function. And in China, there tends to be, especially with things like banquets or a dinner, you order way too much food because it's a show of prosperity and a show of abundance, and it's considered rude to not have huge amounts of food left over. That's broadly speaking, China's a huge place, but just this is what that law was intending to target. So they adopted this law where even things like binge eating videos, which are popular, you can get in trouble for doing that now. So these are sort of competing ends of the addressing consumer norms spectrum, where it's, either giving light information and resources, or, the hammer, the stick of fines and things. Ideally, I think something more in the middle would be the most appropriate way to tackle that. Getting close to the end here, but going after greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So this is what I was referencing earlier when we were looking at that chart of what types of foods are most prevalent in food waste. And I referenced that if you really wanted to address greenhouse gas emissions, you'd be going after things like livestock production, and rice production is actually also big for greenhouse gas emissions. So many countries are now actually fitting greenhouse gas food waste into their national strategies on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I see questions coming into the chat. I haven't looked at them yet, but I will in a moment when I'm done with this. Scaling up financing. Again, this is about making sure that smallholders have access and poorer countries have access to the money they need to develop new infrastructure, invest in new technologies, etc. And so this would be both private sector and organizations like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank that tend to provide financing for these sorts of things. Overcoming the data deficit. I think I already talked about this plenty, but we just don't have great data in many places, and we would be able to do so much more with more data. And then finally, advance the research agenda, and that's about just finding new innovative ways to tackle food waste and hopefully make some new dents in this issue through technologies and products and things that we haven't even experienced yet. So again, these all come from our, that's blurry. These come from our report, Reducing Food Loss and Waste, Setting a Global Action Agenda. If there's any aspect of that you were more interested in looking into, my email address was in the beginning. You can email me, or this link, there's a big long version and there's also an executive summary. And then I have the Q&A, but I just want to point out in the back of the slides, I have an appendix that I'm not going to get into because you'll see it's a ton of text, but it drills into some more specific actions throughout each stage of the supply chain. So I kept it very high level, but you'll see for each stage of the supply chain, we have what each actor in that area needs to be doing. And so it gets much more into some of the specifics behind that drills down from those 10 aspects of the global agenda. So yeah, I see there are 7 chats, which I'm now going to open, but yeah, I'm not sure how you'd like to handle the Q&A portion, but very happy to take any questions.
Brian, first, thank you so much for this presentation. This was kind of the perfect segue into the rest of the seminar presentations that we're going to have. So on behalf of all of us here today and folks who are going to be listening in at a later point, because this is posted for the broader university community, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience with us today. I think the best way to go about Q&A would be to have Bridget facilitate a kind of summary for you of what was happening in the chat. I'm sure we were both kind of monitoring it while you're presenting. I think there are maybe 1 or 2 questions that came out of that, and some of it was also just some discussion that you may want to weigh in on. And then we can take any other questions that come up from the group.
Great.
Yes, absolutely. Just to echo Alyssa, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think there was a lot of curiosity in the chat about the law in China about food waste, of if you know any more details about that, of how they enforce that, or maybe, is that an effective way of reducing food waste? I think people were curious about that.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question, and is actually one of our sort of question marks, as well as how much is it actually being enforced. My guess is that it's a little bit more of a sort of scare tactic. There are monetary fines that have been laid out, but I don't necessarily think that it's something where someone's going to come knock on your door if it looks like there's food in your trash can. So I think enforcement is iffy, and something we're still sort of waiting to see how it plays out, because that was just in April of last year. So yeah, a little bit of a question mark there. But yeah, I'm seeing that there's some chat about, someone provided the link about the full article. Thank you for that, Samuel. Oops. And yeah, sort of a story, a TBD.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, thank you, Samuel, for sharing that article. I also see a question from Den B. Frank, which was, what does food waste at the beginning of the supply chain look like? How is it getting wasted?
That's a great question. So it can look a number of different ways. So one thing I referenced was if there's not a market to sell the food in, it might just sit in the field or it might get plowed back into the field. In some cases, it's due to storage where bugs will eat it in storage and then you can't sell the food if insects have been chowing down on it. So it can be a number of different ways. It could be that there's a labor shortage where a farmer simply just doesn't have the labor to harvest all of the food in their field, and therefore it ends up just staying on the vine or in the field. It could be animals getting sick on the way to a slaughterhouse, which I know is an upsetting image, but it's, if they get sick or they're not in good conditions or their storage conditions weren't great, they might not be able to be turned into food. So it really can take a number of different forms, but yeah, it's basically every sort of trouble you can think of in terms of why food might not make it off the farm or far off of the farm contributes to food waste in that way.
And Brian, just to jump in, I think you made a really excellent point, when you were showing, I think it was a bar graph that showed where food is wasted by geography. That kind of brings up the point that the context in which food is being produced may also determine what types of causes are affecting food loss and waste at different points, right? So in the developing country context or in places where infrastructure is less developed, there may be, more issues of food loss related to that. Whereas, we'll hear next week from Imperfect Produce that one of the main issues in the United States is related to beauty standards that grocery stores hold. So I think always important to look at the context and the infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful, thank you. Just moving right along because we have quite a number of awesome questions in the chat. We have, what are some tips you'd give about reducing food waste at home? So on the personal level.
Yeah, so on the personal level, it's tricky because it does become a question in many cases of privilege and access to grocery stores and time for cooking. So, my husband and I, we don't have any kids. We live a 5-minute walk from a grocery store. We can make a lot of short trips in 1 week, where that's a great way to avoid food waste is you shop more frequently and you buy less in one trip. But then, of course, we're fortunate in that we are able to do that and we have access in that way. One thing that we used to do and we've sort of fallen off of in our habits is that we would have a whiteboard on the front of the fridge where we would put what is like we need to use in the next few days, which we found to be helpful. You can also just do something more informal of that where you keep it towards the front of the fridge or on a certain shelf that is where it's the stuff that you need to use right away. If there's compost in your area, compost is definitely better than a landfill. So if there's composting that you have access to, that's another way where, once it's gone moldy or, ends of vegetables and things, that's a great way to at least lessen the impact of that.
I love that. Those are all amazing ideas. And maybe Alyssa and I can open up a discussion on Canvas where we can all share and collaborate some of our own ideas from this class as well. That I loved how you mentioned how you live close, and so that's an intersection with kind of some geography and urban planning. Another question we got was, how does your work interact with or combat some of the rhetoric of overpopulation, racism, et cetera, that can come up in conversations around food scarcity and waste?
Yeah, that's a That's a great question. My colleagues and I would often joke that in the days of in-person conferences, there's always one person who seems to be population guy, who loves to just stand up and talk about overpopulation. And surprise, they were usually from Europe or the US. So it's fortunately not something that comes up a huge amount in my particular area because I think it's hard to be against food waste and it's hard to blame it too specifically on things like overpopulation, but certainly in food work in general, that comes up a ton. And so, I just try to point out that it's not the diet of someone in sub-Saharan Africa that's high in carbon. It's our diet here where we're eating a ton of meat and, we're having the food shipped to us from all over the world. So it's not something that again, I am lucky that it is not rhetoric that I encounter more in my work, but it definitely comes up every now and then. And it's, I guess my only sort of positive note on that is that I do tend to find that it's coming up less over time, or maybe I'm just doing a better job of ignoring it.
Awesome. Glad to hear that's lowering. We have another question. How do you incentivize businesses and countries with food redistribution or just lowering the overall food loss and waste?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question or the $1 billion question. There are a number of different incentives you can use. So again, there's the more punitive approach where you just pass a strict law and say, you can only throw away this much food, and beyond that, you get fined. That's the approach in Japan. It's the approach in some US states where it's just basically a tax or a fine structure. So that's one way where if there's the political will for it, you can just tax the food waste and hope that that market mechanism helps. On the incentive side, like in the US, we have what's called the Good Samaritan law, where companies are, if they donate food and someone gets sick, then they're not legally liable for that. But of course, there's still the court of public opinion, where they still don't want to have their names in the news about someone got sick from the food we donated. So that's intended to incentivize and reduce some of the barriers, but some companies still will be a little gun shy about donation because of that and redistribution. Also, the food bank approach is something that the US is, or at least for many years, was sort of uniquely, food banks were very much an American thing up until maybe the last couple of decades. So other countries don't have quite so much of a culture of redistribution. That is starting to change. But it's also just something culturally that you have to help others get adjusted to because, the US food banking system is definitely much more elaborate than most other countries.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're getting just so many questions. Students are just really engaging. And so I want to be mindful of the time, especially because I know that Alyssa does have some announcements as well. So I think I'm just going to ask one last question and then encourage everyone else to reach out via email or see if we can open up a discussion post on Canvas to get these questions answered. And a question that I got that I think will apply probably to a lot of people is, are there, or how can I get involved with firms like the World Resources Institute as a student with interest in public and global health? So how can students get involved in these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started at WRI as an intern, and I've now stayed here for 12 years, which I'm a millennial, and I am definitely the person amongst my friends who has been at the same job for the longest. So that's not necessarily common, but internships, I would say, are a great way to get started. If there's a specific topic that you're interested in, my feelings won't be hurt if it's not food waste, but if there's another topic and there's an organization where you think their work is cool, email somebody, just reach out. people love talking about their work and love hearing that people are interested, especially, those of us who are working on this in the nonprofit sector. I'm certainly not doing it for the money. I'm doing it because I care about this issue and I want to try to make a difference. And so for many of us, when we hear from a student or a young professional who, is similarly passionate, at the very least, people are usually happy to have a short chat or point you towards somebody who might be interested, or they might be aware of an internship or some sort of role like that that might be a good fit for you. So I'd say, yeah, don't be shy. It can be intimidating, but don't feel shy about reaching out to somebody and just saying, hey, I saw your blog post, I saw your paper, it was pretty cool, and I would love to know more about your work and any opportunities you're aware of.
Awesome. What great advice. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. A round of applause if you can react. And, yeah.
I see people are sharing some of their own tips at home, which is awesome.
Yes. Brian, really our chat is so active and engaged, and Bridget and I will be compiling sort of any comments or reflections from students about your presentation for you. We'll compile it. We'll try to keep it down to one or two pages, but just so you can see the conversations that you've gotten started and some of the insights students have drawn from your presentation today. So Brian, thank you so much for your time today. This was really wonderful, and it's so exciting to hear about the work that WRI is doing on food loss and food waste, especially this new 10 by 20 by 30 initiative. Really fascinating. And as always, it seems like we have a lot of work to do in research and data collection. So any folks interested in that space, the sky is wide open for you to come and lend your skills and expertise, and also ideas for helping all actors across the food chain to create impact in the area. So Brian, thank you. Happy Friday. And we are going to let you sign off as we handle some administrative items for the course. And for folks tuning in from university community, or if you've accessed this link via Nutritional Sciences YouTube channel, we're gonna chat about class now. So this is where you may want to discontinue following. But again, Brian, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thanks everyone for the active chat and for joining on a Friday. I know that I was not excited about Friday classes when I was in school, so I really appreciate the great turnout. All right, bye everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian.